Can you speak to these two scenarios? Rudy maintained as recently as last night in an interview that was too bizarre to play here, that Donald Trump was his client, his only client. That's a story that he's sticking with, but it seems increasingly implausible. Can you just help pull the thread on those two scenarios based on what we know about the investigation and Rudy's public statements?
Sure, Nicole, I think the answer to your question is it can be both. Rudy Giuliani can be looking at criminal exposure from his actions, and he also can pose a significant national security threat. I mean, these stories are unbelievable to me. I've done probably dozens and dozens of defensive briefings, and the logic of these things is that the person you're briefing, when they're confronted with this intelligence, that they typically, almost always in my experience, place the law and their patriotic duty to the United States ahead of their own self-interest. And that didn't happen in this case. And the reason that's important, one, beyond the fact that it's simply staggering from an unpatriotic and an un-American sort of point of view, is that it put Rudy Giuliani, it gave him the knowledge that he was dealing with people who were essentially the mouthpiece for Russian disinformation and who were in contact with the Russian government. The fact that he continued to choose to interact with them, to take their information, removes his ability to simply say, hey, I didn't know what I was dealing with. I didn't know who these people are. So if you're building a criminal case, that goes a long way to sort of demonstrate his state of mind and what was and wasn't going through his mind as he continued to meet with all these folks.
But Pete Strzok, his partner in crime, and I use it as a euphemism, was Donald Trump. I mean, you know, what he says and what he said to all the Ukrainians involved, and this is Donald Trump's own words on that call with Zelensky. Trump says, Mr. Giuliani is a highly respected man. He was the mayor of New York City, a great mayor, and I would like him to call you. I will ask him to call you along with the Attorney General. Rudy very much knows what's happening, and he's a very capable guy. If you could speak to him, that would be great. And then he says, Ambassador Yovanovitch is going to go through some things. I will have Mr. Giuliani give you a call, and I'm also going to have Attorney General Barr give you a call, and we'll get to the bottom of it. So he's telling Zelensky that Yovanovitch is going to go through some things. Does that look different in light of what we're learning about the scope of the warrant, that the FBI investigators want to look at those communications about Yovanovitch's smearing, reputational damage, and very rushed, urgent removal from the country?
Of course it does. The warrants, through reporting, say that he's being looked at for a violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And why that's important is that this isn't so much the work he was doing for Trump as work that he might have been doing on behalf of Ukrainian interests. Now, what makes this such a mess and such a corrupted mess is that those all relate to each other. They all sort of align. But what investigators are looking at are, were there people in Ukraine, were there Ukrainian politicians, were there other intelligence interests who were pushing Giuliani to help get Yovanovitch removed because she was pursuing a strong anti-corruption agenda? And, you know, if you're corrupt, the last thing you want is somebody who is pursuing anti-corruption endeavors. So all of these things come together in this kind of nasty mess that has potential criminal elements, that certainly has national security elements. And Rudy Giuliani finds himself smack dab in the middle of all of that.
And, you know, lest our sort of ability to be shocked sort of be dead forever, the idea that Rudy Giuliani was briefed by the FBI, that he was in the middle of, a target of, an asset of a Russian disinformation campaign, and he proceeded anyway, says something so gross about the closest people to Donald Trump. And I wonder, Ben Rhodes, if you can unspool that for us.
Well, Nicole, we used to have this question, right? Were the Trump people essentially useful idiots of Russian intelligence, or were they witting? And I don't think you can sugarcoat this anyway, Nicole. Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, was a witting asset of Russian intelligence. Full stop. Like that happened. We now know that. He was told that these theories about Hunter Biden, these theories about Ukraine is really the one that hacked the DNC, these were products of Russian intelligence and security services, and they were being funneled through Rudy Giuliani, the personal attorney for the president of the United States of America. And we can't be shocked anymore, but if I told you 10 years ago that the president of the United States would employ a personal attorney who would go to Ukraine and serve as an asset of Russian intelligence to his knowledge, right? And the other thing that has to be kept in mind here, Nicole, is there's a war going on in eastern Ukraine. Tens of thousands of people have died there. The corruption in Ukraine is the way that Russia is seeking to exert influence over Ukraine and dominate Ukraine and win that war, essentially. So this isn't just some kind of side issue, some distant country where there's some minor, graft happening. When we talk about corruption here, we're talking about a war that has happened. So the stakes could not be higher for Ukraine and for American national security. And the fact that, the entire Republican Party doesn't seem to care that senior people like this were acting as assets of Russian intelligence and disinformation should shock people. If it doesn't, the whole concept of national security doesn't really mean much anymore.
But Katie Benner, maybe it is the beginning of what Bob Woodward describes as this process of the truth emerging about the nature of the Trump-Russia relationship. And these two stories, the one in the Washington Post that revealed, I think for the first time, that the FBI had told Rudy and Ron Johnson that they were both targets of Russian disinformation, and they disregarded those briefings and proceeded, as well as this New York Times reporting that we started with about the scope of the warrant really being focused on the communications about Yovanovitch. What's your understanding of what they're probing? Are they looking for a conspiracy or a net or accomplices, or what are they searching for?
Certainly, they're going to try to see whether or not they can prove, because this is a FARA case, that Rudy Giuliani was working on behalf of Ukrainian interests, pro-Russia interests in Ukraine to push out an ambassador who was for law and order. What becomes tricky is that Giuliani has said that he was working for Trump, and you see that Trump's interests in this case were likely aligned with pro-Russian interests. So what the Justice Department is trying to do is to sort out where Trump's interests ended and Russia's interests began. And I think that what we've seen through reporting is those two things were really closely aligned. So what we're seeing in this story is not only what Woodward said in terms of the real truth about Trump's investment in Russian interests, we're also starting to see that the impact of that was perhaps greater than we knew. And that we're looking at these echo effects, it's always reverberating. But Trump was not always allied with American people. And it was no better seen than in this distrust of the FBI that we see that Giuliani had in that briefing. To Rhodes's point, certainly he was acting at the behest of Russia, and he knew it, but he also did not believe the FBI.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.